Welcome to Life and Faith from the Centre for Public Christianity. I'm Natasha Moore. Well, we hear a lot about the age-old conflict between science and religion, but is it really age-old? Or does it belong more properly to the realm of myth and legend than to history? Professor Peter Harrison was Professor of Science and Religion at Oxford at the same time as Richard Dawkins was there. And these days he's Director of the Centre for the History of European Discourses at the University of Queensland. He's written a lot about this topic of the true history of science and religion and their relations. And he recently delivered CPX's Richard Johnson lecture entitled The End of Faith, Has Science Made Religion Obsolete? CPX director John Dixon interviewed Professor Harrison while he was in town for the lecture. In this episode of Life and Faith, we're bringing you some of the highlights from that conversation.
Peter, thanks for joining us. You were formerly Professor of Science and Religion at Oxford, and I'm sure some people will be surprised there is such a chair. What on earth does a Professor of Science and Religion do? Do you have to wear two hats, two coats, what?
Well, I think it can be a number of different things, John. In the past, the chair has gone to historians who have looked at the historical relations between science and religion. And the present incumbent, Alister McGrath, he was a scientist, but became a theologian. So he's had a kind of foot in both camps. But really the idea is to look at these two major social forces which have had, or in the present have, somewhat tense relationships sometimes, and to see what a good relationship would be between science and religion, and certainly for myself and for John Brooke, who were, as I say, historians, to look at the past relationships between science and religion.
You were there at a very interesting time, of course, because the Professor for the Public Understanding of Science was Richard Dawkins,
yes,
who traded a lot on the clash, the absolute clash between religious claims and scientific claims. Can you just reflect with me on the notion of God as described in New Atheism, because very often it's seen as just like unicorns or fairies. How does that idea of God as just an object in creation that we can't prove exists so he doesn't exist, how does that compare with the classical notion of theism from Aristotle to Aquinas?
Yeah, look, I think it's a good question. Sometimes you hear the new atheists say things like, well, when I was 12, I realised there wasn't a God. And I think that precisely the point, in a way, that adolescent conceptions of the deity are somewhat easy to dismiss. That if your conception of God is some kind of person-like figure out there who's putting the universe together in some kind of way, and that's all he does, and that theology is really about how God put the universe together, then you're going to have problems with that conception of God, and there are going to be conflicts between science and religion. Part of the problem then with new atheists is that they lack theological sophistication, which is to say they don't really understand the kind of rich and robust conceptions of God that are part of the religious traditions, and of course Christianity is one of these. And because they don't understand that, the sort of God that they're dismissing is not a God that actually maps onto the religious convictions that they purport to see science conflicting with. And I think this is actually a distinctive feature of the new atheism. If we think about the old atheists, atheism is a kind of, it dates back to antiquity, but in its fully fledged form of denying the existence of God, it's quite a modern thing. But atheists like Nietzsche or existentialists like Sartre, they knew what was at stake in the denial of the existence of God in a way that I think the new atheists don't.
Because they had a robust education in this tradition.
Precisely, they were philosophically sophisticated, they knew what was at stake.
Perhaps the quintessential story of the clash between science and religion is that of Galileo being tried for heresy in the 17th century. John and Peter got talking about his case.
How do professional historians of science read that story? Because there's no doubt the story is told today as the archetypal science versus religion.
Yeah.
It has parabolic force now.
Yes.
But how is it discussed amongst your academic colleagues?
Yeah, look, the Galileo affair is, one of the most raked over historical episodes in the whole of the history of science. It's got all of the elements of a great story. The lone hero championing this thesis in the face of religious bigotry and opposition and this huge, powerful institution that closes him down. Now, to some extent, that part of it is true. So we need to be clear about the facts that the Holy Office of the Catholic Church told Galileo in 1616 not to teach or defend the Copernican hypothesis, which is the hypothesis that the sun is at the centre of the solar system. And in 1632 he was placed on trial, found guilty of vehement suspicion of heresy for having taught this, having been told in the past not to, and that he was then placed under house arrest. So that's the truth of it. Now the question, I think there are two questions. There's one, whether the Galileo affair was really about science and religion, and two, whether this was a typical kind of thing that the Catholic Church did, whether it was emblematic of their attitude to science. And the answer to both of those questions, I think, is no. Whenever a new scientific theory comes into play, there's going to be scientific resistance to it, that the scientific community generally has a stake in the existing paradigm, as it were. And the fact is that Galileo didn't have the scientific evidence he needed to establish beyond reasonable doubt that the Copernican model was one that could satisfactorily displace the one that was there. So, for example, you could get as good predictions from both theories. The predictions were about the same. Galileo had an argument from the tides that was just completely wrong. He must have known this, but he thought this was an argument for the motion of the Earth. He had some very good arguments from telescopic evidence, but he was one of the few people in Europe who actually had a telescope. So it wasn't that the scientific community could have access to that. The point is that the scientific consensus was pretty much with the older view. And when Copernicus, and here's another interesting feature about this, Copernicus had proposed this 50 years before, and it was largely unproblematic. Now, two things made it problematic. I think the fact that Galileo wanted to say this is more than just a model, more than just a mathematical model, but the context of the Protestant Reformation is the other key thing here. So Catholics were, at this point, were very tetchy about challenges to their authority, and Galileo represented one of those. So was this a science-religion controversy? In part, it was between two competing versions of science, and the Church backed the wrong side. So that's one element of it. And the other element of it is that Galileo actually had religious supporters. So it wasn't a science and religion controversy. Was it typical of the Catholic Church? No. It was actually very out of keeping with the way they tended to deal with science and philosophy. And the Catholic Church gave more support to the study of astronomy from, say, the 14th to the 18th centuries than any other single institution, and probably all institutions put together.
The other great emblem is Charles Darwin on the origin of species. Can you tell us, just historically, what was the response of the Church back in 1859 or whenever he published that book to the book? Were they all out to get him then as well?
Yeah, look, I think the case with Darwin is similar in some respects, but there was a lot more at stake religiously, I think. You know, the apparent literal truth of Genesis is clearly contradicted by Darwinian theory. The uniqueness of human beings could be a problem. If we've evolved from lower forms of life or other forms of life, where did our moral sensibilities come from, or where does the soul come from? So there are a range of religious issues involved here in a way that was not the case in the Galileo affair. In terms of religious reactions to it, they were mixed. So there were some religious figures who were clearly opposed for some of those reasons that I've talked about. But there are also a number of religious champions, and we hardly ever hear about these. But the most prominent was probably the Presbyterian professor of botany at Harvard. And this guy was Darwin's chief PR operator in the States. He was very interested in Darwinian theory of evolution, promoted the theory of evolution, but remained a firmly committed Presbyterian. His name was Asa Gray. Now, he had discussions with Darwin about the various theological implications of the theory, but nonetheless was a significant supporter of the theory. Charles Kingsley, a high churchman who we know as the author of The Water Babies, said that the Darwinian theory was a much more grand theory of creation than God actually specifically going out there and doing it himself. So the idea is that God instantiates or puts in place a framework of laws that nature then rolls along and generates life. And so for Charles Kingsley, this was a much more sophisticated version of creation than a kind of miraculous intervention to create special kinds. And a number of other Christian thinkers had similar views.
If you've just joined us, you're listening to Life and Faith from the Centre for Public Christianity. Today we're bringing you some extracts from an interview between John Dickson and Peter Harrison, who was Professor of Science and Religion at Oxford and these days is at the University of Queensland. Professor Harrison has been debunking the widely held view that the history of science and religion is one of conflict.
It seems like the clash between science and religion is far more complicated, not clear-cut at all. Maybe the clash isn't really the clash it's built up to be. What's the cause of the modern belief that there's a clash? What's behind it? Was there some PR campaign in the 19th century, or it just really doesn't make sense that this seems to be an assumption of many that science and religion cannot get on?
It's something that certainly historians of science have been scratching their heads about for some time, because over the past 50 years, historians, certainly not only me, but any historian of science who's interested in the historical relations between science and religion really puzzle over why the conflict myth, as we call it, is so persistent. So it's an interesting sociological question. What we do know is that it originates in the 19th century, and I mentioned Thomas Henry Huxley before, he's Darwin's bulldog. Thomas Henry Huxley was very concerned to get science into the mainstream, and we have to understand at the time that, from the 17th to the 19th centuries, science was not the prestigious activity that it now is. And the big universities, the ancient universities in the UK, Cambridge and Oxford, it was the humanities. That's where it was at. And the scientists were the poorer cousins. And science went on in the other, lesser, as they would say, lesser universities. But it was the clerical establishment that really ran the show. And Thomas Henry Huxley wanted to change that. And he saw in science and in evolutionary theory in particular a way to almost invent a conflict so that science could become much more prominent publicly. And I think he was enormously successful in doing that. Now, it's true, I think, that in the 20th century there have been, let's not deny, there have been conflicts between science and religion. And young earth creationism is perhaps the most prominent example of religiously motivated anti-scientific. But what we have to understand is that this is, historically speaking, a very recent thing. So most religious thinkers had accommodated themselves to the geological understanding of the age of the earth all the way along. So even religious thinkers who objected to Darwin's theory had no problem with a very long earth. The notion of a young earth creationism was really the invention of a Seventh-day Adventist thinker in the early 20th century, and it was again revived in the 1960s by the two thinkers, Whitcomb and Morris, who wrote a famous book called The Genesis Flood, where they argued that the flood was actually responsible for all the fossil deposits, and that's where you get young earth creationism. So it's important not to see young earth creationism as the kind of standard Christian position from the start and now reasserting itself. Young earth creationism is itself a creation of the 20th century. It's quite a new thing.
I want to close by asking you, if you don't mind, about your personal convictions about God and what nourishes them, because some would feel being an academic who's across science and history would chip away at any notion of theism.
I think for some people it does, and it's very interesting if you look at the sociological data we get about academics. The tendency is to think that the scientists will be the most religiously sceptical. Now, in fact, they're not. It's actually the social scientists who are the most sceptical and the humanities scholars who are the most sceptical. And what this suggests is that there does seem to be a correlation between higher education and religious scepticism, but it's not the science that seems to be most corrosive of religious belief, but knowledge of other cultures, I think, is a crucial one. So I think there's an incipient relativism, and I'm not critiquing that, but people who are familiar with the traditions of the social sciences and the humanities, when they see the diversity of opinions that exist in the world, that's what makes them deeply sceptical. Now, on the other hand, the scientific mindset, if I can call it that, actually tends to see universal truths everywhere. And that's a big difference, I think, between the sciences and the humanities and the social sciences. And that's why I think there's a kind of disjunct. It's these claims about the universal veracity of a form of knowledge. That's where science actually has taken over the mantle of Christianity that claimed that there were universal truths, and that it's the humanities and social sciences who tend to be more sceptical. Now, I can just say for my part that I've been immune to those corrosive pressures. I'm an optimist about how the world is, and I like to think that there is something to moral intuitions. I think that deeply held moral intuitions about what's right and what's wrong, and capacity to be hopeful about the prospects of the future. It's very difficult to get those off the ground unless you have some religious convictions. So I'm optimistic about the world, and that's not what's primary, but I think that goes hand in hand with religious conviction.
You've been listening to Life and Faith. We've been giving you a taste of John Dixon's interview with Peter Harrison, who's Director of the Centre for the History of European Discourses at the University of Queensland. If you'd like to listen to Professor Harrison's Richard Johnson lecture, which was delivered in Sydney in May, you can go to the CPX website at publicchristianity.org. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.